I'm 66 years old now, and when the night settles over these mountains like an old blanket, I hear echoes of a life I swore I'd never speak of again. The wind slips through the pines in long, tremoring sighs, and every time it does, I feel myself pulled back to the autumn of 1984, to a forest that stripped me of certainty and gave me a secret I could never return. I was a young FBI linguist then, restless, dutiful, hungry to prove that language could unlock any mystery. I believed truth had structure, and everything feared could eventually be translated. That belief did not survive what I saw in those woods, though I walked into that assignment, unaware that the ground beneath me was already shifting. The assignment came on a rain-dark morning, the kind where the sky felt close enough to touch and every breath tasted of wet soil. A team had been deployed to a remote stretch of woodland on the Washington-Oregon border, a place thick with fog and stories locals whispered only after too much whiskey. Hunters had reported enormous silhouettes moving between the trees. At first, I assumed it was another wild goose chase, but urgency in the briefing hinted at something different, something alive and afraid. The forest greeted us like a wary animal. Mist clung to the undergrowth, turning every branch into a pale, ghost-like finger. The air smelled of wet cedar and something else, warm, musky, like fur soaked in rain. Agents carved out a clearing with searchlights and generators, but the wilderness pressed in, unwilling to yield its secrets. When I stepped onto muddy earth, I felt a tremor beneath my boots, subtle but real, like the ground itself was bracing for what we would uncover. They brought me to a reinforced trailer station in the clearing's center, a metal box sweating with condensation. Windows blacked out, as if the darkness inside needed protection. 2 guards unlocked the door, and I entered expecting an animal, a specimen, something I could classify. What I found instead forced me to inhale so sharply my ribs ached. 2 figures crouched in chains. A towering male, easily 9 feet tall even while hunched, and a smaller female whose calm gaze froze me more completely than the cold. Their fur was thick and matted with twigs and soil, their limbs powerful, their breasts deep and resonant. But it was their eyes, human in depth, ancient in sorrow, that unraveled every assumption I carried. Intelligence lived there, and fear, and something like recognition. The male reacted first, unleashing a guttural roar that shook dust from the ceiling. Metal groaned. Tools rattled. His fury was raw, but beneath it pulsed something heartbreakingly familiar. Fear. The female reached toward him, brushing his arm with fingers capable of crushing stone, yet moving with maternal gentleness. Her presence steadied him, and then she looked at me as if weighing my intentions with a single breath. I raised my hands, not out of fear but instinct, the way one might approach a wounded creature, deciding whether to trust or strike. "I'm not here to hurt you," I whispered. I doubted they understood, but the female tilted her head, as if intention mattered more than language. A soft vibration rolled from her chest, low and melodic, and for a moment the cold air warmed with the possibility of connection. My supervisor's voice crackled in my earpiece, ordering immediate communication attempts, origin, behavior, threat assessment. But the language unfolding before me wasn't made of words. It was breath and rhythm, vibration and memory, a tapestry woven through bone rather than sound. I tried mimicry. Simple tones at first, then variations of pitch and resonance. The male watched, suspicious but attentive, while the female's eyes softened with each attempt. When I mimicked a low pattern, she repeated softly. Something settled in the room, as if an invisible line had been crossed. Hours passed. Rain pattered steadily on the metal roof. The scent of their fur, the damp floor, the cool air, it all wove into a cocoon of quiet revelation. I didn't see creatures or anomalies. I saw a pair bound together by something deeper than circumstance. Their breath synced when the male grew agitated. The female's gaze flicked to him before each movement. They weren't prisoners. They were partners in grief. I sensed loss clinging to them like fog. Outside, tension grew. Agents muttered. Radios crackled. My supervisor demanded measurable progress. He saw them as threats or assets, never as beings with stories older than ours. Yet each minute I spent in that trailer tightened the knot beneath my ribs. Something in me leaned toward them with quiet defiance, though I couldn't explain why. Dusk settled, and the trailer dimmed to a gray hush. The female shifted her weight and produced a new tone, 5 pulses, rising then falling. There was hesitation in it and vulnerability. I responded carefully. She watched me with an intensity that hollowed my lungs. Then she repeated the sound, softer, as if asking a question. I didn't understand its meaning, but I felt its weight. It wasn't about survival or danger. It was about me, who I was, what I carried, what I might become. A question that pierced deeper than any interrogation I'd ever conducted. I answered anyway, mimicking her pattern with the most honest breath I could offer. She exhaled a trembling hum, one that felt like relief. The male's shoulders eased slightly. The air warmed. In that moment, without realizing it, I stepped beyond the boundary of the man I had been. The forest hadn't just taken my name. It had chosen me for something I wasn't ready to understand. If I had known what her next sound truly meant, I might have turned back. But I leaned closer, drawn by something older than duty. Her eyes shimmered with a depth I hadn't seen in any interrogation room. A plea shaped not in language but in hope. The male shifted, watching, and the world narrowed to 3 of us. Rain, breath, and an unanswered question waiting to change everything. For the next 5 days, the trailer became a world unto itself. A dim metal cocoon where rain tapped the roof like restless fingers, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp fur and cold steel. Every morning I entered with the same knots in my stomach, and every evening I left with more questions than I'd had before. The pair watched me with a caution that felt almost human, though their silence carried more meaning than any words I could have offered. I tried to focus on the task, determine communication systems, extract origins, classify threat levels, but the woman's earlier question, the one buried inside those pulses, lingered in my chest like an unhealed bruise. The first breakthrough came during a blackout storm on the 6th night. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the trailer in stark white before everything plunged into darkness. Generators sputtered. Guards cursed outside. The entire structure shivered under the weight of wind. In that moment of near black, the female shifted forward, her breath warm against the bars. Her eyes caught the faint emergency glow, and something inside them softened, as if fear had temporarily loosened its grip. She released a low sequence of tones. For pulses, gentle yet deliberate, the vibrations rolled through my ribs rather than my ears. I repeated them instinctively, unsure if my voice carried the shape she intended. But her reaction told me enough. Her shoulders lowered, her posture eased, and a faint rumble, something like gratitude, filled the air between us. The male watched with tense suspicion, but he didn't interrupt. He seemed torn between protecting her and observing me, as if trying to decide whether my presence was threat or promise. In the flicker of emergency lights, I saw his breathing slow, if only slightly. When power returned, the female attempted a new pattern. 5 pulses, with a tremor that felt emotional rather than communicative. I mimicked her again, feeling foolish yet strangely honored. She echoed the sound a second time, lightly tapping the floor with her knuckles. The tap produced a subtle vibration that spread through the trailer's frame. That was when I understood her language wasn't merely spoken. It was lived. It flowed through muscle, bone, breath, and memory. It was closer to music than speech, closer to heartbeat than syntax. Still, my supervisor dismissed every report I submitted, calling them sentimental exaggerations. He wanted aggression, differentiation, classification. He wanted proof these beings were dangerous. But everything I felt told me the opposite. The more time I spent with them, the more their fear unraveled into something painfully familiar. They weren't beasts cornered by hunters. They were refugees, clinging to each other the way drowning people cling to drifting wood. On the 9th day, the female tapped a long pattern across the metal floor, soft, rhythmic, full of pauses that felt intentional. I closed my eyes, letting the vibration travel upward through my spine. Grief radiated from its cadence, the kind of grief that doesn't shout but settles into the body like cold. I attempted to mirror the pattern with my fingertips, my knuckles never quite matching hers. But she watched me with a tenderness that reminded me of someone teaching a child to speak. When I faltered, she repeated the sequence patiently, as though reminding me we had time. The male paced during these exchanges, chains clinking against the frame. His agitation wasn't directed at me, but at the walls closing in on them. When he did speak, his tones were deeper, rolling to the floor like distant thunder. He communicated in shorter rhythms, often only single pulses with long silences between. His language felt like the language of scars, compressed, defensive, forged from survival rather than connection. Yet now and then, when the female hummed something soft, his breathing matched hers. Together, they were a conversation I couldn't fully decipher, but felt privileged to witness. On the 12th morning, I arrived early, the air sharp with frost. Inside the trailer, I found them leaning together, their heads touching lightly, a slow hum passing between them. Not words, comfort. When they noticed me, the female straightened, and the male released a low pattern I hadn't heard before. It rose, dipped, and ended with a tremor that tightened the muscles in my neck. I attempted to echo it. My voice cracked midway, but I finished the sequence. The male's eyes locked onto mine, not with hostility, but with startling clarity. For the first time, he acknowledged me not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as someone who was trying to understand. That was the moment something shifted. The room felt warmer, the air easier to breathe. I realized I wasn't simply decoding a language. I was being invited into it. Their tones weren't just sounds. They were memories, warnings, stories etched in vibrations that carried lifetimes of running, hiding, losing. Every pattern they shared with me was an offering, and I accepted each one with increasing reverence. My supervisor, however, had grown impatient. He cornered me outside the trailer that afternoon, demanding progress reports that fit the narrative he needed. "These creatures are dangerous," he snapped. "Your job is to prove it." But danger was the one thing I felt decreasing day by day. The threat wasn't inside the trailer. It was outside it, creeping closer with every order, every question asked with suspicion rather than curiosity. That evening, I returned with a weight between my ribs I couldn't name. The pair sensed it instantly. The male stiffened. The female tapped a short pattern, questioning, cautious. I couldn't bring myself to lie. I tapped a slow pulse in return, my version crude but honest. Her gaze deepened with an emotion I recognized all too well. Fear. She responded with a long vibration, slow and aching, her fingertips trembling against the metal floor. The meaning didn't come to me as translation, but as feeling, a warning, a plea. And when she finished, she lifted her eyes to mine and tapped the final 2 pulses that struck the air like a heartbeat. What she asked of me in that moment changed everything. I wish I had known why. The storm began before sunset, rolling over mountains with a violence that made the ground feel hollow beneath my boots. By the time I reached the trailer, wind was flinging needles of rain sideways, rattling the aluminum walls like something trying to claw its way inside. I remember pausing at the threshold, gripping the cold handle, feeling the tremor of unease that had grown inside me since the female's warning the night before. I didn't yet know the shape of the danger, only that it was coming and fast. Inside, the air was colder than usual, as if the storm had slipped through the seams. The male paced in a restless loop, his chain scraping softly with each turn. The female watched with her usual composure, but there was tension in her breath, a sharp hitch before each inhale. When she saw me, she tapped a short pattern, question, concern. I knelt and answered with the slow vibration she'd taught me, trying to reassure her, but my fingers trembled, betraying more than I wanted. The male halted his pacing and released a deep thrum that vibrated through the floor. Not anger, not warning, something closer to resignation. I understood enough of their language now to hear the message behind it. The storm outside wasn't the one they feared. Before I could respond, the trailer door slammed open and my supervisor stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat. His jaw was clenched in a way I'd learned meant orders had come from higher up. Without looking at the pair, he told me extraction had been approved. They were to be moved to a black site before dawn. Their value, he said, is no longer linguistic. He avoided the word weapon, but it hung in the air like smoke. The female lowered her head, emitting a low, shuddering tone that struck me like grief in its purest form. The male surged forward, chain snapping taut, his roar so powerful it rattled every loose bolt in the trailer. My supervisor flinched, but didn't back away. He ordered tranquilizers prepared. I felt something inside me crack at those words, a fracture made of helplessness and rage. The pair had done nothing but survive, and survival alone had made them targets. I tried to argue. I spoke of sentience, intelligence, empathy, words that meant everything inside that room and nothing outside it. My supervisor's response was cold logic, the kind that crushes nuance like gravel beneath tires. "You're too close," he said. "You've forgotten what's at stake." But what was at stake? His career? Their freedom? My humanity? Even I couldn't answer that yet. That night, the guards doubled. The storm grew worse, thunder splitting the sky in jagged bursts. Water seeped through the trailer's corners, forming dark puddles along the floor. The pair huddled close, their breaths synchronizing in slow, steady waves. I stayed with them as long as I could, until the guards forced me out. The female tapped a final sequence as I stepped through the door, 4 pulses, each softer than the last. "Don't leave." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. I returned at midnight, slipping past distracted guards who were struggling with flickering floodlights. The power grid had been strained all evening. The storm was winning. Inside the trailer, I found them as before, but their eyes were different, darker, knowing. The female reached toward me, fingertips brushing the bars. When I touched them, warmth surged through my palm. She tapped a long vibration that trembled through her bones into mine. I didn't understand the full meaning, but I recognized the tone. Farewell. The male released a soft, low sound that carried none of the fury he'd shown earlier. It was a sound of someone preparing to face something inevitable. I wanted to tell them I wouldn't let it happen, but promises felt fragile in a world run by orders. The extraction team arrived an hour before dawn. Their boots splashed through mud, radios hissing with clipped instructions. When they entered the trailer, the female pressed herself against the male the way she had when I first met them. They didn't fight at first, but when the first tranquilizer dart hit the male's shoulder, everything broke. He lunged with a force that shook the trailer. Chains snapped from their anchors, metal screaming, guards shouting. The female cried out, a sound so raw it carved through the storm outside. I pushed through agents, yelling for them to stop, but another dart flew, then another. The male staggered, dropping to one knee, his breath turning ragged. The female reached for him desperately, only to be struck herself. Her roar, higher, filled with terror, echoed in my skull long after it fell silent. As they collapsed together, their bodies slumping in one intertwined shadow, the trailer seemed to shrink around us. The air thickened with the scent of wet fur and chemical sedative. I knelt beside them, my hand trembling against the cold floor. Their eyes fluttered open just long enough to find mine. The female tapped a weak vibration, barely a breath against the metal. I leaned closer, heart hammering. 2 pulses. Short, urgent, run. The storm howled. Agents shouted for restraints, and something inside me finally snapped free. Because those 2 pulses weren't a warning about the agents or the black site, or the sedatives now swimming through their blood. They were about something deeper, older, heavier. Something they had sensed long before I did. Something closing in around all of us. I rose slowly, my hand still on the cold floor, and understood with a clarity that chilled me more than the rain ever could. The danger wasn't that they would be taken. It was what would happen when they were gone. I followed the convoy long before I had a plan, guided only by